The fields around Kursk were not won by tanks alone. Records now show that the outcome of 1943's Great Clash depended less on valor than on industry, planning, and exhaustion. Behind the thunder of armor lay a contest of factories, railways, and attrition that neither side fully controlled. Let's uncover the 10 facts about the Battle of Kursk that history never told in full. 1. The Battle of Prokhorovka was the largest tank battle in history. For decades, the name Prokhorovka has stood as a symbol of armored warfare, the day when thousands of Soviet and German tanks clashed in the largest single tank battle ever fought. Schoolbooks, wartime films, and even museum exhibits long repeated the figure of over 2,000 tanks locked in deadly combat. Yet detailed archival research reveals a far different reality. The truth of Prokhorovka is not one of scale, but of endurance, miscalculation, and propaganda. The myth began during the war itself, when both the German and Soviet commands exaggerated numbers for morale and prestige. Soviet reports described mass tank battles to illustrate the Red Army's courage, while German accounts sought to dramatize the scale of the struggle to rationalize their costly failure. Post-war historians often relied on those wartime claims, cementing the legend in public consciousness. However, battlefield records and unit diaries from both sides reveal that only a fraction of the reported numbers were present. The Tepofi SS Panzer Corps, attacking toward Prokhorovka on July 12, 1943, fielded roughly 294 tanks and assault guns, while the Soviet 5th Guards Tank Army deployed around 800 vehicles. The battle's intensity came from the narrowness of the battlefield, barely a few square miles of steppe, not the vast number of machines. German Tiger and Panther tanks, though technologically superior, were hindered by terrain and lack of mobility. Many Soviet tanks were destroyed by German defensive fire rather than offensive countercharges, contradicting later depictions of a massive head-on tank collision. Moreover, Luftwaffe operations and Soviet anti-tank positions contributed as much to the outcome as the tanks themselves. Modern analysis of wreck sites and strength reports confirms that total losses at Prokhorovka were significantly lower than the legend suggests. The myth of the largest tank battle in history thus conceals a more intricate truth. Kursk was defined not by a single day of tank duels, but by weeks of attrition, minefields, artillery, and engineering. Recognizing this corrects decades of misunderstanding and shifts attention to the real determinants of success: logistics, defense in depth, and command coordination. The legend of Prokhorovka endures because it captures the imagination, but the records reveal a battle fought not by thousands of tanks, but by exhausted armies trapped in the machinery of industrial war. 2. Soviet defensive preparation at Kursk reached an unprecedented scale. Before the first German tank crossed the front lines of the Kursk salient, the Red Army had already built a fortress unlike anything seen on the Eastern Front. The salient's geography, a bulge extending westward into German lines, made it an obvious target for Hitler's summer offensive, Operation Citadel. Soviet intelligence anticipated the attack months in advance, allowing for a defense of remarkable depth and density. Engineers and soldiers transformed hundreds of miles of open steppe into layered belts of fortifications. Each belt consisted of trenches, barbed wire, bunkers, artillery positions, and minefields, arranged to absorb and bleed the advancing panzers. In some sectors, mine density exceeded 3,000 per kilometer, creating a killing ground where German tanks could scarcely move without triggering explosions. Anti-tank ditches, camouflaged gun nests, and overlapping fields of fire created a network of resistance that defied the blitzkrieg model. The defensive depth reached nearly 300 kilometers, with 6 to 8 separate lines in key sectors. Behind them stood reserves ready for counterattack, supported by rail lines that ensured continuous resupply. The Soviet command's patience proved decisive. While the Germans delayed their offensive to field new Tiger and Panther tanks, the Red Army used every week to reinforce and expand its defenses. By July 1943, more than 1 million Soviet soldiers and thousands of guns, tanks, and aircraft awaited the assault. When the German spearheads finally advanced, they faced not a single front, but an industrialized defense system. The impact was immediate. Panzer divisions stalled, casualties rose, and the cost of every kilometer increased. German tactical skill could not overcome the mathematical weight of Soviet engineering. The Soviet defense at Kursk was thus not a mere reaction. It was a strategic inversion of blitzkrieg itself. By forcing Germany into a frontal battle of attrition, the Soviets shifted the balance of initiative. The Battle of Kursk demonstrated that the age of rapid breakthroughs was over. Industrial warfare had become a contest of endurance, production, and planning. The Soviet defense, built in silence and patience, became the foundation of the Red Army's later offensives and the symbol of a new kind of war, one won by fortitude rather than speed. 3. German armored superiority guaranteed victory at Kursk. The enduring image of Kursk often begins with the silhouette of a Tiger tank, the supposed symbol of German technological dominance. In popular history, these heavy machines, armed with long-barreled guns and thick armor, are presented as invincible, sweeping across the Russian steppe. This image, however, owes more to wartime propaganda and post-war memoirs than to the battlefield reality of 1943. The German army entered Operation Citadel with approximately 2,700 tanks and assault guns, but only a small fraction were the new Panthers and Tigers. The majority remained Panzerabwehr and assault guns that had already seen years of combat. Moreover, mechanical reliability was a critical weakness. In the first week of the offensive, up to half of the newly introduced Panther tanks broke down before reaching combat positions due to engine fires and transmission failures. The Tiger's formidable armor could stop Soviet shells, but its heavy weight made it slow and vulnerable to immobilization by mines and soft ground. German records indicate that a significant number of armored losses resulted not from enemy fire, but from mechanical failure, fuel shortages, and inability to recover damaged vehicles under fire. On the Soviet side, numerical superiority and tactical adaptation compensated for technological disparity. Soviet anti-tank guns, mines, and coordinated artillery barrages neutralized many of the German advantages in firepower. Crews were trained to use terrain and camouflage, ambushing advancing panzers and striking from multiple directions. The sheer scale of Soviet resources also meant that lost tanks could be replaced within weeks, while German losses were increasingly irreplaceable. The myth of German armored invincibility collapses under these realities. Kursk revealed that superior engineering could not overcome the limits of logistics, production, and exhaustion. The German tank force at Kursk was powerful but brittle, capable of inflicting local damage but unable to sustain operations. When the offensive ground to a halt, the same tanks that had inspired fear became stranded steel monuments to overextension. The fall of the myth exposes a deeper truth. Technological brilliance cannot substitute for industrial depth, and by 1943, Germany no longer possessed the reserves to fight an industrial war of attrition. Kursk marked the moment when machines ceased to decide battles. Economies did. 4. Industrial power and logistics, not heroism, decided the battle for generations. Histories of Kursk have celebrated courage: the tank crews who advanced into minefields, the gunners who stood firm under bombardment, the commanders who refused to retreat. Yet beneath the human struggle lay an impersonal but decisive force: industrial capacity. By mid-1943, the Soviet Union had mastered the art of wartime mass production. Factories relocated beyond the Urals operated day and night, producing T-34 tanks, artillery pieces, and munitions in quantities Germany could no longer match. In June alone, Soviet industry delivered over 1,000 new tanks, many arriving directly at the front. German industry, though efficient, faced shortages of raw materials, fuel, and labor. Bombing raids, partisan attacks, and bureaucratic rivalry reduced output and delayed delivery of spare parts. Every destroyed tank or gun at Kursk represented an industrial equation. Could it be replaced faster than the enemy's? The Soviets could, and the Germans could not. Supply networks mirrored this imbalance. Soviet railways, under centralized command, ensured that reinforcements and ammunition flowed continuously to the front. In contrast, the German army's supply lines stretched across occupied territory, vulnerable to air attacks and sabotage. As Operation Citadel dragged on, German fuel depots ran dry, and armored units were forced to halt. When Soviet counteroffensives began, the Wehrmacht could not regroup or resupply effectively. Kursk thus became the first battle on the Eastern Front determined less by tactics than by logistics. The ability to replace, repair, and redeploy outweighed the heroism of any individual soldier or tank commander. Industrial warfare had reached maturity, and Germany, despite its engineering excellence, could not sustain it. The myth of the heroic turning point gives way to the fact of systemic collapse. Kursk was not won in the trenches, but in the factories and rail yards. The Soviet Union's capacity to wage continuous, large-scale warfare marked a new phase in the conflict, one where steel and fuel dictated victory more than courage or strategy. 5. Kursk was the immediate turning point of the Eastern Front. History books often describe Kursk as the instant when the tide of war turned decisively against Germany, the moment when Hitler's army lost all offensive potential and the Red Army seized irreversible initiative. While Kursk was indeed a critical blow, this simplified narrative conceals the gradual nature of strategic change. German forces did not collapse overnight. After the failure of Operation Citadel, the Wehrmacht remained capable of local offensives, counterattacks, and defensive operations. The myth of an immediate reversal likely stems from Soviet wartime propaganda, which framed Kursk as the crowning moment of triumph following the victory at Stalingrad. In truth, the front stabilized for several weeks before Soviet counteroffensives gathered momentum. The Red Army's advance following Kursk, operations such as Kutuzov and Rumyantsev, succeeded not because Germany suddenly weakened, but because German reserves were exhausted and stretched across multiple theaters, including Italy and the Balkans. The attrition at Kursk consumed the last reserve of German offensive potential, but the strategic balance shifted slowly as Soviet production, manpower, and logistics continued to expand. The Wehrmacht fought on for nearly 2 more years, inflicting heavy casualties, yet it could no longer dictate the tempo of war. Understanding this gradual shift refines our sense of historical cause and effect. Kursk did not end the war, nor did it alone destroy German power. It marked the irreversible transition to strategic defense. From this point forward, Germany would react rather than act, bleed rather than conquer. The myth of an instant turning point simplifies the complex interplay of exhaustion, industry, and morale that defined 1943. The truth is quieter and more enduring. Kursk was the moment when the momentum of history changed direction, not through a single victory, but through the cumulative strain of an empire fighting beyond its means. 6. Intelligence and deception, not surprise, shaped Kursk's opening. Public narratives often portray the Battle of Kursk as a sudden eruption, the German Wehrmacht striking a vulnerable Soviet salient in a calculated surprise offensive. The image of a bold, unexpected assault has persisted for decades, reinforced by early post-war accounts and Western interpretations of blitzkrieg doctrine. Yet declassified Soviet intelligence reports and German war diaries reveal a very different sequence of events. Kursk was perhaps the least surprising major operation of the Eastern Front. The Red Army knew precisely when and where the attack would come. This awareness was not accidental, but the result of a sophisticated network of intelligence gathering, aerial reconnaissance, and code breaking. Soviet agents, including those within neutral countries, intercepted German planning discussions as early as April 1943. Photographic reconnaissance flights recorded German troop concentrations near Orel and Belgorod, while partisan units transmitted continuous updates on rail movements and supply depots. German delays, driven by Hitler's insistence on deploying new Panther and Tiger tanks, only amplified Soviet awareness. Each postponement allowed Stalin's general staff to refine defensive belts and reallocate reserves. By the time Operation Citadel commenced on July 5th, Soviet commanders had even received the exact date and time of the attack through intercepted Enigma transmissions and prisoner interrogations. German surprise, the linchpin of Blitzkrieg strategy, had evaporated months before the first artillery barrage. The Red Army's early morning counter-bombardment on July 5th, launched minutes before the German opening salvo, demonstrated how completely the Soviets anticipated every move. This foreknowledge transformed the course of the battle. The Wehrmacht advanced not into confusion, but into pre-sighted fire zones. Soviet artillery and aircraft struck German staging areas before they could achieve momentum. German after-action reports lamented that the enemy was waiting. This fact dismantles the myth of German operational superiority at Kursk. The supposed surprise offensive was, in truth, an assault into a trap meticulously constructed by intelligence and preparation. Kursk thus became not the triumph of initiative, but the triumph of information. An early demonstration that in modern industrial warfare, knowledge had become as decisive as steel. 7. The Luftwaffe dominated the skies over Kursk. In wartime films and post-war literature, the German Luftwaffe is often depicted as a formidable and nearly uncontested air force, sweeping the skies over Kursk with precision strikes and supporting armored columns with relentless power. The popular narrative holds that Soviet air operations were secondary, clumsy, and largely reactive. However, operational records from both sides tell a far more balanced and far more revealing story. By mid-1943, the Luftwaffe's edge had already begun to erode. Years of attrition on multiple fronts had thinned its veteran pilots and stretched its logistics. The Luftwaffe committed roughly 2,000 aircraft to Operation Citadel, facing more than 2,800 Soviet planes drawn from the Steppe, Voronezh, and Central fronts. While German air units achieved local successes in the opening days, particularly against Soviet ground formations, their advantage was fleeting. Fuel shortages, rapid Soviet replacement of losses, and coordinated Soviet air command soon reversed the balance. The Red Air Force's new Yak-9 fighters and Il-2 Stormovik ground attack aircraft were deployed en masse, operating from forward airfields rebuilt specifically for the Kursk operation. By July 10th, Soviet pilots were flying more sorties per day than their German counterparts. The Luftwaffe's inability to maintain continuous air cover allowed Soviet bombers to target German supply convoys and bridging points, strangling operational momentum. German field reports repeatedly note the growing enemy air superiority during the later stages of the battle. Furthermore, the Luftwaffe's earlier losses in Tunisia and the Atlantic had already reduced its reserve strength. Pilots were overworked, aircraft maintenance was inconsistent, and spare parts were scarce. The myth of German air dominance thus collapses under operational data. Air power at Kursk was not a one-sided affair, but a complex equilibrium in which Soviet numerical strength and organization gradually overwhelmed German skill. This erosion of Luftwaffe capability foreshadowed the air balance for the rest of the war. The skies over Kursk were no longer a German domain. They had become contested territory, signaling the twilight of air superiority that once defined Hitler's early victories. 8. Command disunity weakened the German offensive before it began. Popular accounts often present the German command structure at Kursk as a disciplined, unified machine. Hitler directing strategy, the Wehrmacht executing with precision, and elite divisions coordinating in perfect synchronization. The image fits the myth of German operational genius. In reality, internal division, conflicting objectives, and command interference undermined Operation Citadel from its conception. By early 1943, German High Command was divided over how to proceed on the Eastern Front. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein advocated for a flexible defensive strategy, drawing the Red Army into mobile counterattacks rather than frontal assaults. In contrast, Hitler and the OKW demanded an offensive aimed at recapturing initiative and prestige. The resulting compromise, a pincer assault on the Kursk salient, satisfied neither vision. Within the Wehrmacht, even the timing of the offensive was contested. Generals Model and Hoth pushed for an early strike in May, while Hitler postponed repeatedly, insisting on deploying new weapons such as the Panther tank and Ferdinand assault gun. Each delay reduced German readiness, allowed Soviet defenses to expand, and deepened frustration among commanders. Operational planning suffered as a result. The northern and southern pincers were placed under separate commands that struggled to coordinate movement. Communications were fragmented, air-ground coordination inconsistent, and reserve deployment delayed by bureaucratic disputes. When the offensive finally began, differing operational doctrines produced uneven results. Model's cautious approach in the north clashed with Hoth's aggressive tactics in the south, dispersing strength instead of concentrating it. Hitler's personal involvement worsened the problem. Orders from his headquarters demanded rigid adherence to objectives, leaving field commanders little room for adaptation. After the Allied landing in Sicily on July 9th, Hitler's attention split, and within days he ordered the offensive halted, despite local gains. The result was an operation that lost coherence before achieving momentum. The illusion of unified German command dissolves under these facts. Kursk revealed the limits of centralized leadership in total war. Too much control from above, too little trust below. The offensive failed not solely because of Soviet resistance, but because the German command system had begun to fracture under the weight of conflicting ambitions and fading resources. 9. Soviet victory at Kursk was achieved through human wave tactics. For decades, Western and German accounts depicted Soviet strategy as crude, an overwhelming flood of men and machines thrown into battle with little regard for losses. Kursk, in this version, was won by sheer numbers, not by planning or tactical sophistication. This portrayal, convenient to both wartime German propaganda and Cold War narratives, grossly underestimates Soviet operational maturity by 1943. After the hard lessons of 1941 and 1942, the Red Army had transformed its command structure, integrating intelligence, artillery coordination, and mechanized maneuver into a coherent operational doctrine. The defensive plan for Kursk exemplified this evolution. Soviet forces were arranged not as static lines, but as elastic defensive zones, designed to absorb the German assault, wear it down, and then transition to counteroffensive action. Artillery coordination reached unprecedented levels. Over 20,000 guns and mortars were positioned, with pre-sighted firing data. Soviet tank units, once dispersed, were now concentrated in mobile reserves capable of rapid redeployment. The myth of reckless mass assaults ignores the methodical nature of Soviet strategy. Soviet commanders like Rokossovsky and Vatutin orchestrated movements based on reconnaissance and real-time feedback, using radio communication and map coordination to synchronize defense and counterattack. Human losses were still immense, but they were the consequence of intensity, not indifference. When Operation Citadel stalled, the Soviet counteroffensives, Kutuzov in the north and Rumyantsev in the south, demonstrated high levels of planning and timing. These were not improvised pursuits, but planned operations exploiting enemy exhaustion. The Red Army's growing professionalism, logistical precision, and use of combined arms signaled the maturity of Soviet warfare. Kursk proved that Soviet success stemmed from organization and adaptation, not blind sacrifice. The myth of human waves masks the truth of a military force that had learned from catastrophe and turned experience into structure. It was this transformation, not mass alone, that carried the Red Army from defensive survival to strategic dominance. 10. Kursk marked the rise of the Soviet strategic offensive doctrine. In the immediate aftermath of Kursk, the front lines shifted gradually westward, but the deeper change occurred within Soviet strategic thought. The victory did not merely stop a German offensive, it initiated a new era of sustained offensive warfare. Before 1943, Soviet operations often faltered after initial success, constrained by logistics, coordination, and exhaustion. Kursk altered that pattern. The immense mobilization, coordination, and industrial synchronization required to prepare the battle had given Soviet command the blueprint for continuous operations. Once the German offensive failed, Soviet counterstrikes began almost seamlessly, supported by mobile reserves, air coordination, and logistic depth. The operations Kutuzov and Rumyantsev, launched in July and August 1943, were executed with precision, maintaining pressure along the entire front. For the first time in the war, the Red Army demonstrated the ability to sustain large-scale offensive operations over weeks without operational collapse. Industrial output and transport coordination allowed replacement of losses in real time. The Stavka's command system now functioned as a continuous cycle: offensive, regrouping, re-equipping, then advancing again. The concept of deep operations, first theorized in the 1930s but never realized, finally materialized after Kursk. Soviet forces no longer sought local breakthroughs, but aimed for systemic destruction of enemy capability. The battle's aftermath thus marked a transition from survival to mastery. German forces, though still formidable, could not regain initiative. Kursk's strategic legacy lies in this evolution, a shift from reaction to permanent momentum. The lessons learned there, mass coordination, multi-front integration, and sustained pressure, became the foundation of every Soviet campaign thereafter, from the Dnieper to Berlin. The fact of Kursk's enduring importance is not simply that it halted Germany's last great offensive, but that it revealed the full industrial, organizational, and intellectual maturity of the Red Army. The war from that point forward would be fought on Soviet terms, driven by a doctrine of relentless advance, born out of a battle once defined by defense. History rarely tells everything, but what it leaves behind still defines us. The Battle of Kursk was not only fought in steel and fire, but in the limits of endurance and the silence of those who understood what was lost. If stories like this matter to you, subscribe and let the record of truth remain unbroken.